The title of this talk is An Integrated Climate Change Response, the Role of Population. And you see this dramatic increase in the human population, 7.6 billion for the moment. And that happened over just the last 100 years. And there's a risk that this will continue by another 3.6 billion people. So, of course, this is behind the problem of climate change, as well as consumption is behind this problem. Actually, the population factor is not that difficult. It's the population size in a given area, like Sweden, is determined by just 4 factors. First, it's birth coming in, we have deaths, and we have immigration and immigration. So those 4 factors determine the number of people in a country. Now, we have an international view of the problem here, and this is quite important, births. And there is a concept there that we will use in this talk, which is called fertility. The fertility rate is defined as the average expected number of children per woman, and it has a strong relation to population change. So fertility, you can get that measure for a given year, and then it's based on all women in the population that have given birth, each cohort up to when the reproductive age disappears. So that measure is important, and I will show you a graph where you have that on the x-axis here. So this is fertility rate, and each dot here is a country. This shows you the world's countries here. And on the y-axis, you have population change. Here, increase in population and decrease in population. So this is just about 19 countries, decreasing a little, only slightly. They're all European countries and Japan. But you see, most of the countries are increasing. And it may look like a 2% increase. That doesn't sound very much. But actually, an annual 2% increase means that the country will double its population in 35 years. That's worth remembering. A 2% annual increase of the population will lead to a country double its population in 35 years. So, if we take a global perspective, this is the average global fertility rate, 2.5 children per woman. So, and then it's good to know also the global, so-called global replacement rate. That is 2.1 children per woman. And if we have that, the global population would stabilize. So we don't have that. And the UN make population projections. And this is the latest one. We have a new in August. And what they project and think is most likely is this medium variant. This curve going up to 11.2 billion from present 7.6 billion. It's important to know that this assumes that fertility goes down. So here it will be 2 child per woman. So they assume that fertility will go down. If that doesn't happen, the human population will be much larger. And then Jenna will also show this. If you have fertility minus half a child, you can get this population at year 2100. Or if you have plus 0.5 child, you may get that population in year 2100. So now I'm supposed to, Jenna will continue this talk. So going into details about climate.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So, as Frank said, small fertility changes have large impact on our future population sizes. But he's talked about the future mostly, so I'm going to take a look back at the past and how past population growth has influenced emissions to get us to where we are today. So here we can see that the total annual CO2 emissions have steadily increased for the past 4 decades. And so if we break that down by change in annual emissions by decade, we can sort of decompose the influence of the 3 factors in the IPAT concept into population, economic growth, and technology. And that's what the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has done here in this graph. And so you see the influence of population is shown in light blue. The influence of economic growth is shown in dark blue. And technology here is represented by 2 factors, carbon intensity in orange and energy intensity in yellow. So you can see the contribution of population growth has been steady in this increase of greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions throughout the past 4 decades. Economic growth has also been a primary driver and has risen substantially in the past decade. And the decreases generally due to technological advances such as renewable energies and energy efficiencies has offset some of the emissions, but not offset enough of them of the driving emissions due to economic and population growth. And when we think about solutions that are generally discussed for climate change, we think about renewable technologies. Okay, we think about low consumptive. Gross domestic product. Okay, so when we think about solutions to climate change, we think about technological solutions. We also think about low consumptive lifestyles, so switching to a plant-based diet, flying less, and even sort of degrowth economics has started to get a little headway. But how could addressing population help us slow and prepare for climate change? So here again, we see the 3 UN variants, the median variant leading to a population size of 11.2 billion by the end of the century. And as Frank said, just small fertility changes, a global average of just half a child more or half a child less per woman, have substantial impacts on their future population sizes, which then in turn will have impacts on future emissions. So here we see annual CO2 emissions projected throughout the century, assuming the business as usual median variant. But if instead each woman were to have, let's say, half a child more on average, then emissions would increase 60% by 2100. So let's say we take a different course where each woman on average has half a child less. And so in that case, then annual CO2 emissions would decrease by 40% by 2100. So this makes sense as each additional person is going to increase emissions. But how does that compare with other factors that we're currently investigating to try to solve climate change? Actually quite well. So here we see 3 scenarios compared to a business as usual scenario. So the business as usual scenario is shown by the solid black line on top. And so that scenario is assuming one where trends are broadly going to follow their historical patterns. So if we have a lifestyle change scenario in which consumers adopt low consumptive lifestyles, like primarily plant-based diet, or flying less, then we would see a decrease in emissions of 12%, compared to the business as usual scenario by 2100. A renewable electrification scenario is assuming that we're going to have higher electrification rates in all end-use sectors and optimistic assumptions for the integration of renewable technologies. A low population scenario is assuming a population projection similar to the UN low variant that I just showed you in the previous slides. And both of those would lead to a reduction of emissions 25% by 2100. So you can see over the course of time, the emission reductions in the low population scenario and renewable electrification scenario are equivalent and even more than the lifestyle changes. So why are we not talking about this? Why are we not talking about how lower population would help us achieve some of those emission reductions necessary to avoid dangerous climate change? And how could we achieve that low population path? In the UN variant, it's just an assumption, okay, every woman has half a child less, but how could we actually achieve those numbers? Well, by embracing low fertility. So there have been lots of headlines in countries, coming out of countries that have some fertility, like my country, saying that we're not making enough babies. Well, I disagree with that statement. I think that there are plenty of Americans in the world, and I think that that sort of embracing that below replacement fertility and the associated emission reductions that come with it from a more sustainable population size is a good thing. In addition, we're lucky, in Sweden at least, to have complete control over our fertility. Couples can freely decide the number and the spacing of the children that they want to have, but it's not like that in lots of parts of the world, many parts of the world. And so if we wanted to achieve that low population path that you've seen, what we can do is expand family planning so every woman in the world has access to contraceptives and the means to be able to have control over her fertility. So one of our colleagues here at the Overpopulation Project modeled what this world would look like, a world where every couple can decide freely the number and spacing of the children that they have. And what she found was that giving a concerted global effort for family planning, then we would follow a population path very similar to the UN low variant, achieving a population size of 7.5 billion by 2100. So not only is family planning an effective emission reduction measure, but it's also cost effective. So here we see the carbon abatement cost for various measures. And you can see that so carbon abatement is essentially how much it costs to avoid 1 ton of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere. So you can see that it costs about $4 to avoid 1 ton of carbon dioxide if you are using family planning, which is about half the cost of building efficiency, a seventh the cost of renewables such as wind and solar, and just a fraction of the cost of carbon capture and storage. So far we've talked about population in terms of reducing future emissions, but how could slowing population growth help us adapt to the current climate impacts and also prepare for future climate impacts? Well, quite a bit actually, because there is a trend that high fertility countries will be hit harder by climate change impacts. So here we see the relationship between exposure to climate impacts, so for example, reduced crop yield or reduced groundwater runoff, and fertility rate on the x-axis. The bubbles are a country, and the bubble size is indicating the population size of that country. So you can see the two most populous countries stand out here in this graph, India and China. And you can see that India's large population base is going to be quite exposed to future climate impacts. In addition, the country that has the highest exposure is Maldives, which is an archipelago, like a low-lying archipelago in the Indian Ocean, and just less than 1 meter of sea level rise will result in a complete loss of the land area of that country, so it will essentially no longer exist. So it makes sense why that country is the one that has most exposure. And also a country that has the highest fertility rate and the second highest exposure is Nigeria. And generally that exposure is due to projected drought impacts. And so, as I said, we see in general that higher fertility countries are going to be hit harder by climate change impacts, particularly in the continent of Africa, shown here by the orange dots. Population growth in the African continent is not only going to put pressure on resources that are being impacted by climate change. So, for example, there's going to be, let's say, decreased groundwater runoff, right? So there's going to be less water available due to climate change, but there's also going to be less water available per person sheerly due to population growth. So let's take water availability and look at that. So here we see the change in per capita water availability in the year 2100 compared to the year 2000. So the red is indicating where there's going to be a decrease in water availability. The blue is indicating where there's going to be an increase in water availability, and the tan, there's relatively little change. So if we zoom into the harder hit area of West Africa, we can see that due to both climate and population change, there's going to be about 645 million people living in water-stressed areas by 2100. Oh, sorry about that. Can you see that? Oh, it just popped up on my screen. Okay. So we can isolate the influence of those two factors, right? So if we hold climate constant and we just change population, we can see that almost the same number of people are going to be living in water-stressed areas, about 630 million. On the other hand, we can isolate the factor of climate change, keeping population constant, and if only the climate changes, then there would be significantly less people living in water-stressed areas. So what is this showing us? This is showing us that when we're taking a look at the availability of future resources, particularly in areas that have high fertility, population growth is going to be the primary driving factor of future resource scarcity, second to climate change. And not just this study, many studies have found this to be true. that population is the primary driving factor and climate change is the secondary one for future resource scarcities. But so that's not to minimize the effect of climate change. Obviously, we need to address both climate change and population growth, but what's often missing is that we're not addressing population growth and we're only addressing climate change. But as you see here, if we were to address climate change and not address population growth, there would still be millions of people living in water-stressed areas. So it's not enough to address one factor and ignore the other, but we must address both. And many high fertility countries have recognized the need to address population growth. Here we see least developed countries who have submitted a national adaptation plan of action to the UN. So there's 40 countries that have done that. 37 of those have identified population growth as an issue related to climate change in their national plans. Furthermore, specifically family planning as an adaptation action has been recognized on a local scale through community and individual-based interviews, on a national scale in those plans that I just showed you, and also on an international scale. The International Panel on Climate Change, in their 2014 adaptation report, identified family planning as an action that would not only improve health of individuals and communities, but also reduce emissions. So family planning will help individuals, communities, and countries be better prepared for climate change, which means that they will increase their adaptive capacity or kind of their readiness to live with climate impacts. So how will it do that? Well, as I said, it will increase the availability of climate-sensitive resources. So if you have a limited resource that's being impacted by climate change and also being impacted by population growth, if you reduce population growth, then you'll have a higher per capita availability of that resource. It'll also increase the capacity of institutions that may become overburdened by climate change. So for example, one other impact of climate change is that communicable diseases like malaria may reach places that they haven't reached before. So that means that more people will be going to the hospital, more people because of more people have malaria, but also more people because there's more people in general, right? So if we're able to address both of those factors, then those institutions will be better prepared to help their clientele. It'll also improve maternal and infant health. And also, if there's women that are having less births and girls aren't getting married and having births as early, then they will be able to stay in school. And women won't be having the responsibility to raise children, so they will have opportunities to join the workforce, producing a stronger labor force as well, a stronger, more educated labor force. So in summary, there are both climate and human benefits of taking that lower population path that I showed earlier. So climate benefits, right? Going to decrease emissions, which means that you're going to lessen the magnitude of climate change. So over the course of the century, emissions could be reduced 25 to 40%. That's comparable with other solutions, and it's a cost-effective abatement option, family planning is. Using family planning will also increase adaptive capacity, right? It will increase resource availability, improve health, and help women become more empowered in their societies. So solving climate change will require a truly integrated approach that addresses all of the drivers and utilizes all options, technology, economy, or affluence and consumption, but also population. So then I guess the remaining question is, how can we include population in a climate change response? Well, first of all, I think that everyone can consider having one less child. That is the most impactful individual action that you can take for the climate. Also, governments, donors, NGOs, and individuals should invest in family planning so every woman in the world has complete control over her fertility. And so right now, only 1% of the overseas development assistance is allocated to family planning. If that was raised to 2%, and also developing countries match that proportion, then that would close the gap and we would be able to improve and expand family planning services on a global level. Also, social change. So one component of family planning programs is changing social norms so the barriers of women to access and actually use those methods of contraception are removed. And so this includes the creation of a small family norm, and acceptance and encouragement from prominent social leaders, such as religious leaders, is really important in that change. And lastly, countries that are naturally declining, countries that have below replacement rates, as Frank showed a little bit earlier on his graph, should accept that natural decline and the climate benefits that come with more sustainable population sizes. So reducing population growth on its own will not solve climate change. Other measures, including technological solutions, personal lifestyle changes, policies to reduce fossil fuel emissions, and the development of alternative energy sources are essential. However, the positive impact of all of these measures are going to be reduced and could even be potentially negated by continued population growth. Therefore, if we want to have a truly integrated climate change response, then we must include population. Thank you. So now we can take questions, I guess.
I don't quite understand the definition of fertility rate. Is it that you take all the women existing today and the number of children that they have had and calculate the average? Or is it that you look at all the women that exist today and all the children that they are expected to have? Or, yeah.
It's current. Well, fertility rate, yeah. So generally, the UN calculates it over the course of 5-year intervals. So like from 2010 to 2015, the average number of children that each woman had on a global level. That would be the fertility rate of that 5-year period. Mm-hmm.
I think actually that was Frank that showed a slide that the total population size is determined by several factors, and you have been described in detail the fertility rate, but you also had death, you had immigration and emigration. I mean, even if you work hard on the fertility, if people live longer, if more people are immigrating or less immigrating, then you have not really solved the problem.
Well,
so
that's true, but I mean, we wouldn't advocate for decreased longevity or like length of life to help with population sizes, because people living longer is a good thing. And when we're talking about climate change, it's a global issue. So really, where those people are living, they're still going to be emitting greenhouse gases and being affected by the climate change impacts no matter where they're living. So when we're talking about a global issue like climate change, really the factor that we can address is births, is fertility rate. Any other questions?
No, it's not a question, but I was very fascinated about the scale of coal, oil that we use. You showed these curves.
I can pull that up. Yeah. This one?
We have 10 years to change the emissions.
Yeah.
So if a discussion around this use would be interesting. Like, I guess we come to it when we talk about economy, because the oil is so essential and the oil doesn't cost very much. But in the future, we need the rest of the oil that we have to develop the new renewable energy sources. And maybe we'll come to that later. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. Is it on? This one works now. Works? Yeah, it just doesn't.
Works? Yeah.
I will come back to the energy supply issues and the technological options in my presentation. I think it's better to wait until then.
What should you say the awareness in the world is about this population growth in perspective to the emissions and climate change?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, people just generally assume that it's no problem, and no matter what the population growth is, we'll be able to handle it and the effects from that. And so there was a discussion about this back in the 1970s, and it received a lot of attention. But since then, it's like really declined and become more of a neglected factor. And so we're starting to see it being recognized a little bit more. But yeah, education and increasing awareness of population growth as an issue related to climate change is something that really needs to be done on all levels, so local, national, and international levels. And so that's something that we're advocating for. And even including population in schools and education programs. So like when you think back to the classes that you had maybe in high school, middle school, elementary school, you don't really have like population classes, but if they were included more in a holistic integrated curriculum, then that would also be beneficial.
The question of family size was tried in China with a bit of a brutal approach. Are you advocating a more sensitive approach than the one-child policy?
Yeah. So our colleague who modeled the impact of family planning throughout the course of the century, that was voluntary family planning programs. And what she did was she sort of looked at the effectiveness of countries that implemented family planning programs from the 70s to the 90s, countries like South Korea, Indonesia, who had voluntary family planning programs that were very effective. They not only had access to contraceptives, but they also had really strong social and media campaigns to sort of change the norm to smaller family norm. And they were very, very effective. So she looked at that impact and sort of modeled if every country were to implement family planning programs that were that successful, then what would the change in population be?
Yeah, you said that the control or the low control of fertility rate is like the primary problem for the population increase. But don't you think that in poor countries that like families want to have more children because they want to like reduce the risk of poverty in the future and because of low social security and stuff like that?
Well, there's been a lot of research that's looked into that, and actually economic growth is generally spurred by a reduction in the population, and then you see the economic growth. So if the population were to be lower and there is less pressure, then that's when economic growth is first spurred. But I mean, yeah.
You mentioned social change as a factor that is interesting, but I had to think of feminism, for example, that could like work within. But how do scientists see these kind of movements? Because I understand they're kind of unpredictable and they're not like set measurements that you can take from that. So do scientists work with this, or is it more like, oh, maybe something happens through this, but we're going to focus on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult to have social science measures in climate change models, which I think is one of the contributing reasons to why it's ignored. But what we're saying is that just because it's like difficult to try to quantify doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider it, right? And I think that it should be more integrated into the climate change response.
You talked a lot about voluntary family planning. What are your thoughts on, I don't know, not sure quite what it is in English, but one-child policy, like similar to what that they have in China? I've heard that being more and more discussed. So, yeah. So the question is, what are my thoughts on sort of a re-implementation of one-child policy in other countries? No, I meant specifically forced family planning. I guess you could say that in China it's illegal to have more than one child. That this very example of the Chinese implementation of one-child policies and
isn't working the best. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the China one-child policy, that's kind of what everyone thinks of when you think of population and how we can sort of get it under control. But we often forget, because that policy receives so much media attention, we forget that other surrounding countries had just as much of a population decline, or not population decline, but a slow in their population growth rate as China did. So, for example, I just talked about South Korea and Iran, and those were voluntary family planning programs. And so it is possible to achieve a slower or reduced population growth rate solely due to these programs.
I could just compliment Jenna. Someone you asked about awareness of population to improve our climate, and it's very low awareness. You all know probably about the Sustainable Development Goals. There are actually 17 goals, and reducing population growth is not one of them. So that shows clearly this is not recognized. That's very unfortunate, because you could see what Jenna, you saw the slides here. You saw that there's very good potential for having a better climate, reducing population growth and family planning. It was very unfortunate, but the 3 international conferences, 1974, 1974, 84, and 94, and the last one in Cairo, and then they diminished. They had no more conferences, and actually the word family planning was kind of disappeared, and it was talked about sexual and reproductive rights. It's fine to have such rights, but we must recognize the size of the human population. It's pretty evident. So there has been some recent initiatives also by Bill Gates, but called FP 2020, Family Planning 2020. Some resources go into that, and that's very good. But if you look at total development aid in the world, family planning is less than 1%. And because of Trump, it probably went down to 0.5%. So it was suggested some years ago, if we increase that to 2% of the total development aid in the world, that could make a big difference. So that's the message.
Yeah. I think it's also more important to point out that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was signed by most, if not all, of the countries in the world, that it is a right for each woman and each couple to have the access, information, and ability to determine the number and spacing of their children. And so if that is not being upheld, right, and people don't have access to be able to control their own fertility, that's a violation of human rights. So, I mean, it's a very sort of complex, multifaceted issue that should be addressed solely because it's a human right, but also because there are all of these other climate benefits, and it's a global problem that we're all trying to address. So really, it's a win-win situation.